December 19, 1944. A French barracks turned into Verdun. The most powerful generals of the Allied command were gathered around a table, and none of them were smiling. 3 days earlier, more than 200,000 German soldiers had broken through American lines in the Ardennes forest. The offensive had completely surprised Allied intelligence. American units were being crushed, surrounded, annihilated. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had called this emergency meeting to stop the disaster. The situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded in Bastogne. If that city fell, German armor could split the Allied armies in two and potentially reach the coast. Eisenhower looked around the table and asked the critical question: how long would it take for someone to attack north to relieve Bastogne? The room fell silent. The generals stared at their maps, calculating logistics, troop movements, supply lines, distances involved, winter conditions, the chaos of disengaging units already in combat. Then George Patton spoke. "I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals turned and stared at him. Some thought he was joking, others thought he was bluffing, making promises he couldn't possibly keep. 48 hours to disengage 3 divisions from active combat. Rotate an entire army 90 degrees. Move more than 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles through snow and ice, and launch a coordinated attack against fortified German positions." It was operationally impossible. Every general in that room knew it. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He wasn't lying. He was the only general in that room who had seen this attack coming and had been preparing for it for 11 days. If you enjoy this kind of content about real World War II stories they don't tell you in textbooks, like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos. December 9th, 1944, 10 days before the Verdun meeting, Patton's headquarters in Nancy, France. Colonel Oscar Koch walked into Patton's office, carrying a stack of intelligence reports that would change the course of the war. Koch was Patton's G2, his chief intelligence officer. He was meticulous, detail-oriented, and deeply concerned. Koch had been tracking German unit movements across the Western Front and had noticed something no one else seemed to care about. 15 German divisions had disappeared. These were not small units. They were full-strength divisions, including several panzer divisions with hundreds of tanks. They had been pulled off the line and moved somewhere. But Allied intelligence couldn't find them. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, had an explanation. The Germans were holding these divisions in reserve to respond to Allied advances. Nothing to worry about. Koch didn't believe it. He had been studying German patterns for months. The Wehrmacht didn't keep 15 divisions in reserve just to react. That was offensive power. That was enough combat strength to launch a major attack. Koch spread his maps across Patton's desk and pointed to the Ardennes forest, a lightly defended sector where American divisions were spread across miles of front. "General, I believe the Germans are planning a major counter-offensive. The objective is here, the Ardennes." Patton studied the maps as Koch laid out his case. The Ardennes was the weakest point in the Allied line. 4 American divisions were holding a front that should have required 12. The terrain was difficult, heavily forested, with narrow roads nearly impossible to navigate in winter. That was precisely why SHEF wasn't worried. The same terrain that made the Ardennes hard to defend also made it hard to attack. No sane commander would launch a major offensive through that terrain in December. But Koch reminded Patton of something crucial. In 1940, the Germans had done exactly that. They attacked through the Ardennes and reached the English Channel in 6 weeks. It was the campaign that conquered France. Koch had more evidence. German radio traffic had increased dramatically in the sector. Prisoner interrogations mentioned new units arriving. Local civilians reported unusual activity behind German lines. Patton asked Koch directly, "If you're right, "When is the attack coming?" Koch answered immediately, "Within the next 2 weeks." Patton picked up the phone and called Omar Bradley, his immediate superior. He explained Koch's analysis. Bradley listened, but he wasn't convinced. Chief Intelligence disagreed. The war was almost over. Germany was beaten. They didn't have the strength for a major offensive. Bradley told Patton not to worry. Patton hung up the phone and looked at Koch. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he gave Koch an order. "Start planning." Over the next 10 days, Patton's staff worked in secret. They developed 3 complete contingency plans to respond to a German offensive in the Ardennes. Each plan was detailed down to the minute. Truck routes calculated, fuel supplies pre-positioned, artillery batteries designated for rapid redeployment, infantry units assigned to specific roads and assembly points. The plans covered every variable. If the German attack came from one direction, the Third Army would execute Plan A. From another direction, Plan B. If the situation required something else, Plan C. Patton's staff thought their general had lost his mind. The Third Army was engaged in offensive operations in the Saar region, advancing toward Germany. Why were they planning for a defensive emergency 160 kilometers to the north? Because Patton trusted Oscar Koch more than Chef. On December 12th, Patton met with his senior commanders and told them to be ready to disengage on short notice. He didn't tell them why, just that they needed to be prepared. His commanders exchanged looks, disengaged from offensive operations while they were winning. But they were Patton's men. They followed orders. By December 15th, the Third Army was the only major American force with contingency plans for the Ardennes. Every other Allied unit was focused on its own sector, confident the war would be over by Christmas. 5:30 a.m., December 16th, 1944. German artillery erupted along a 128-kilometer front. Thousands of shells slammed into American positions. Then came the infantry. Then the tanks. 3 German armies, more than 200,000 men, crushed 4 American divisions. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 4-1. Units that had been resting in quiet sectors suddenly found themselves fighting for survival. Communication lines were cut. Commanders lost contact with their troops. At Chef headquarters, the first reports were dismissed as a local counterattack. It took hours for the scale of the disaster to become clear. At Bradley's headquarters, disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Allied intelligence had assured them the Germans were finished. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived and placed in the Ardennes for a quiet introduction to combat, was virtually destroyed. 2 entire regiments surrendered, the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. But at Third Army headquarters, the reaction was different. Patton received the first reports and immediately summoned his staff. He looked at Oscar Koch. "You were right. What's their objective?" Koch studied the incoming reports. "Bastogne, they need the road junction, then Antwerp." Patton nodded. "Get me General Gaffey. We're executing the contingency plans." While every other American headquarters struggled to understand what was happening, Patton was already issuing orders. The Third Army began disengaging from combat operations in the Saar. Other generals would spend 3 days figuring out how to respond. Patton had solved it 11 days earlier. December 19th, the emergency meeting. Eisenhower had summoned every senior commander in the theater. The situation was grim, but Eisenhower opened with a statement that surprised some in the room. "The present situation is to be regarded as an opportunity for us and not a disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." Eisenhower understood something critical. The German army had come out of its defensive positions. It was exposed. If the Allies could respond fast enough, they could turn disaster into victory. But speed was the problem. Every unit was in the wrong place. The logistics of turning everything around seemed impossible. Then Eisenhower asked, "How long would it take for someone to attack north to relieve Bastogne?" Silence. Then Patton spoke. "I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours, 3 divisions in 72. The room went silent. Patton was known for aggressive promises, but this seemed beyond aggressive. It seemed delusional. Eisenhower pressed him. "George, this is no time for bluffing. The 101st Airborne is surrounded. If we promise relief and can't deliver, those men die." Patton didn't blink. "Ike, I've already given the orders. The Third Army is disengaging now. I have 3 contingency plans ready. I've been expecting this attack for 11 days. The other generals stared. Expecting it? How could Patton have expected something that had completely surprised Schaff? Eisenhower studied Patton for a long moment. He had known him for decades. He knew when Patton was bluffing and when he was serious. Patton was serious. "All right, George, move." Patton left the meeting and made a phone call to his chief of staff. The message was brief. Play ball. Those 2 words activated contingency plans prepared 11 days earlier. Within minutes, orders flowed through the Third Army's communication network. The 4th Armored Division began moving north. The 26th Infantry Division followed. The 80th Infantry Division prepared to disengage and redeploy. Pre-positioned truck convoys began loading troops. Artillery batteries shifted to new positions. Supply depots redirected support from offensive operations to the relief attack toward Bastogne. More than 133,000 vehicles would move through snow, ice, and narrow roads. Other Allied armies watched in disbelief. They were still trying to figure out what was happening in the Ardennes. The Third Army was already responding. Patton wasn't performing a miracle. He was executing a plan. The movement began on the night of December 19th and continued without pause. Imagine turning not a battalion, but an entire army, over 100,000 men, thousands of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, all moving simultaneously, all arriving at the right place at the right time. The weather was brutal. Snow, ice, sub-zero temperatures, broken vehicles, men suffering frostbite. But the movement continued. By December 21st, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division were in position. They had moved more than 160 kilometers in less than 48 hours through the worst winter weather in decades while disengaging from active combat. December 22nd, the Third Army attacked. The 4th Armored Division drove north toward Bastogne. The fighting was brutal. German forces had established defensive positions along every approach. Every kilometer was contested. Tank battles erupted in frozen fields. Infantry fought through forests and villages. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held on, low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. On December 22nd, the Germans demanded their surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent his famous one-word reply: "Nuts." The paratroopers weren't surrendering. They knew relief was coming. December 26th, 1944, 4:50 p.m. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead tank Cobra King, pushed through the final German positions at Bastogne. His tank made contact with elements of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. Patton received the news and immediately called Eisenhower. "We've reached Bastogne." The relief corridor was narrow, and German forces attacked the flanks continuously, but the Third Army held. That night, supply convoys rolled into Bastogne. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. The 101st Airborne had held out for 8 days against overwhelming odds. Now they had what they needed to keep fighting. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month. The Germans failed to achieve their strategic objectives, but they inflicted massive casualties. Over 19,000 Americans killed, more than 47,000 wounded, and another 23,000 captured or missing, the bloodiest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. But the losses would have been far worse without Patton's relief of Bastogne. Had the 101st been destroyed, had the Germans captured that road junction, the offensive might have succeeded in splitting the Allied armies. The intelligence failure haunted American command. How had more than 200,000 German troops achieved complete surprise? How had 15 divisions disappeared without anyone noticing? The answer was simple and damning. Someone had noticed. Oscar Koch had tracked those divisions. He had predicted the Ardennes offensive. He had identified the objective. But Schaff dismissed his analysis. Conventional wisdom said Germany was beaten. A major offensive was impossible. Only Patton listened. Only Patton prepared. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German commanders about their planning. The Germans had expected to reach the Meuse River in 4 days. They expected to take Antwerp in 2 weeks. They expected the American response to be slow, confused, disorganized. What they didn't expect was George S. Patton. German commanders admitted that Patton's counterattack disrupted their entire timetable. They had calculated it would take at least a week for the Americans to mount a serious counteroffensive. Patton did it in 4 days. General Günther Blumentritt later wrote that Patton was the most aggressive panzer general among the Allies. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, was more specific. We knew Patton would react quickly. We did not know he had prepared for our attack. When his counteroffensive struck us, we realized that someone on the American side had anticipated exactly what we were doing. That someone was Oscar Koch. But he was working for George Patton, and that made all the difference. Patton received no medal for relieving Bastogne, no special recognition. Official histories praised the Third Army's performance but rarely mentioned the 11 days of preparation that made it possible. Oscar Koch remained largely unknown outside intelligence circles. His prediction, one of the most accurate intelligence assessments of the war, overshadowed by the broader narrative of surprise and recovery. Within the army, however, the lesson was clear. Intelligence only matters if commanders act on it. Preparation only works if leaders trust their planners. The Schaff intelligence failure wasn't about incompetence. It was about assumptions. Analysts assumed the war was nearly over and interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens. Oscar Koch didn't assume the war was ending. He asked what the evidence actually showed. But good intelligence wasn't enough. Other commanders saw Koch's analysis. Bradley was informed. Schaff saw the reports. All of them dismissed it. Patton didn't. He trusted his intelligence officer. He prepared for the possibility that Koch was right and everyone else was wrong. In the Verdun meeting, the other generals stared in disbelief when Patton said, 48 hours. They thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. He was telling them something they should already have known. The Battle of the Bulge was a failure of intelligence at the highest levels. But it was also the story of one general who listened when no one else would. That's why Patton was the only general ready for the Battle of the Bulge. Not because he was lucky, not because he was reckless, but because he was prepared. And in war, preparation is everything.